To see what really happens when we take the car into a shop, we've put hidden cameras inside, outside, and throughout the rest of the car. Do you think you did anything wrong in there?
Yeah, by being there.
Do you regret?
But yeah, I do, because I should have took care of my stuff at home.
Metro says there may be other reasons for why they don't respond. For instance, if there's a real emergency, just hit the button once, let go, and start talking. Otherwise, the operator can't hear you. And the operator can only take 3 emergency calls at one time. Keller showed up to Montgomery County District Court on crutches with a foot injury to face those charges. He pled guilty to 1 charge.
Blake, Tisha Thompson.
Get out my face.
The judge gave him 12 months of supervised probation and a $500 fine, along with a warning that if he's found selling cars again in Maryland, he could end up behind bars.
Plenty worse things somebody could be out here doing, man. I better take heed.
In Rockville, Tisha Thompson, News 4 I-Team. When you need help, DC Fire is supposed to get there fast. According to medical experts, someone who is not breathing has less than 6 minutes before brain damage or death. Less than 2 weeks ago, DC Fire Chief Ken Ellerby claimed his units respond to calls in 6.5 minutes or less 92% of the time.
We do try to keep the numbers very short and very tight so that we do reduce our response time.
The News 4 I-Team obtained data on all of the calls for DC Fire and emergency medical services from January 2012 until this past May. More than 250,000 vehicles dispatched to the scene of an emergency. At first, we found the data matches much of what the city claimed. But then we discovered some important details that might change the way you look at how the city keeps track of its emergency response times.
You call 911. And a fire engine or ambulance shows up at your front door. That's the time that everybody wants to know.
Edward Smith is the president of the DC Firefighters Association and says he was surprised at what we uncovered. When you call 911, the call taker picks it up at the Office of Unified Communication, or OUC, and sends it to a dispatcher, who then tells the appropriate unit where to go. It's then up to the fire department to get to where it's going as quickly as possible. But we discovered DC Fire only counts the amount of time it takes from the moment a unit is dispatched to when it arrives at your door. It does not include the minutes it takes for your 911 call to move through OUC.
I'm calculating for what we're responsible for, which is time of dispatch to time of arrival on the scene.
According to the chief and his staff, no one in the city keeps track of the entire length of the response, meaning all of these response times could be minutes longer than previously reported.
It's sad. Public deserves to know the truth, and you know, in this age of government, you know, they tout words such as transparency and being collaborative, and we don't see it.
We also noticed there were some very short response times, mere seconds, and incredibly long times, 6, 7, 8 hours in the data. The fire department says these are obviously not right, claiming its system didn't recognize a unit had arrived on scene or a member didn't press the arrival button.
We don't throw out so many outliers that we skew the numbers, but you know, some things are just so short or so extremely long that they would not fall anywhere in the calculation.
So we asked, what do you count? The answer? Any call between 1 minute and 30 minutes.
It's disingenuous. I would call it cooking the books.
Smith says no one had ever told the union the city threw out calls, roughly 8,000 according to our data.
From the documents I've seen from the department, I've never seen that explained in their data sets. So why all of a sudden that comes out now?
Smith says it's very rare for a call to take just 1 minute. That's how long he says it takes a crew just to get into a vehicle, or what's called the shoot time. Smith says the only way a call could take 1 minute is if someone walked into a firehouse with an injury or a vehicle happened to be passing the scene on the way to something else. As for calls taking more than 30 minutes?
Rare instances, if you're going from one end of town to the other, even with lights and sirens, in rush hour traffic, absolutely it's going to happen.
But the chief stands by the data.
We don't skew the numbers that badly. Those are very, very few and far between, and I will say that our employees have responded to the response time and shoot time challenge admirably. I mean, they do get out the door and they do get to the scene pretty quickly.
At the national headquarters for the Veterans Administration, there's a plaque, "To care for him who shall borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan." But some of those left behind say the support is not there.
He'd grab me in the kitchen and he'd dance, and he was just, he was just lovable.
Kim Ruoko says her husband John flew helicopters in the Marine Corps for 15 years. 3 months after his final deployment, John killed himself after struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression.
I just would say I just want to die just because I didn't want to feel that pain. You just don't want to feel the pain.
And I asked him, I said, do you have a gun with you? And he said, yes.
Don Lipstein was the last person to speak with his son Josh.
And I said, is it loaded? And he said, yes. I said, can you just please take the bullets out? He said, I can't do that, Dad.
After 2 tours in Iraq with the Navy, Josh had become addicted to painkillers resulting from surgery that ended his naval career.
When it's a suicide in the military, it becomes so much more complicated. There's guilt, shame, there's just, there's anger, a lot of anger.
Kim and Don are part of a growing group of military families called Suicide Survivors. And they say almost as soon as the funeral is over, they're no longer connected to the military and are left on their own to battle their grief.
And I think we are kind of doing a switch there. I think we realize how important families are, and that they didn't sign up for this but went along for the ride.
Janet Kemp is the director of the VA's National Mental Health Program for Suicide Prevention. Both she and the Department of Defense tell the I-Team they're changing how the military combats suicide and its impact on families, creating a 24-hour crisis line, which Kemp says is for anyone associated with the military. But some families say it's just not enough, resulting in devastating consequences.
I consider my daughter a casualty of this war.
Christine and Bill Koch say they lost 2 children in the war. Stephen, an Army gunner killed in Afghanistan, and his older sister Lynn, who committed suicide following her brother's death.
They give you a list of doctors to see, or try this group or try that group, and there's very little follow-up.
The Koches turned to a nonprofit group of volunteers called Hope for the Warriors.
This is what we've done to try to cling on to life, because the government certainly doesn't care. We are no longer considered military.
I do feel like the siblings are the ones I worry about the most.
Kim says unlike spouses and children, siblings tend to be forgotten. She and Don now counsel all types of family members coping with military suicides for another community service organization called TAPS, or the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors.
We get at least 2 calls a day from a brand new suicide.
A growing list of home front casualties in a battle with no real end in sight. Tearing out and rebuilding a transmission. It's complicated and it's never going to be cheap. But the News 4 I-Team is going to show you why so many customers in our area are unhappy with
AA MCO. For over 50 years, AMCO's been known as the transmission expert.
I was like, AMCO, the professionals in transmission.
Mike Mills said he paid a Virginia AMCO almost $4,000 to rebuild his transmission. But as soon as he drove away,
when the truck shifts from second to third, it like decelerated and then jumped right in the third gear, enough to make me turn around and go back.
He says AMCO's corporate office told him to take his car to a different AMCO location, where he heard a familiar tale.
He said, I need to rebuild your transmission. I said, well, how much is that gonna cost? He said, I can probably get it all done for maybe like $4,000. I said, hold on a second. I go out to the truck, I bring back the paperwork from the other AMCO. He laughed, said,
Mills says AMCO agreed to rebuild the second transmission at no cost, but he says his SUV still isn't fixed.
I just think they got me for $4,000.
The News 4 I-Team discovered there are more complaints filed against AMCO in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia than any other auto repair company in our region. Dozens of complaints about transmissions never getting fixed, even though customers spent $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. My car has been to this AMCO 12 times for the same issue, and now my transmission is completely gone. On the way home, the car sounded like a 747, and the whole car started shaking.
They sell hope where a lot of times there is none.
Mike Johnson worked for AAMCO headquarters from 2010 until last year. A master technician with 35 years experience, he's talking to us because he says AAMCO takes advantage of its customers.
Unfortunately, to be profitable, I think a lot of them cut corners to save money, and the end result is the complaints. Sometimes there's probably a little haste to condemn the transmission.
Johnson and other AAMCO franchise owners say the main goal is to get that transmission out.
The big thing that makes me uncomfortable is the removal, disassembly, and inspection. You know, I think that is unethical.
Johnson's talking about how AAMCO charges between $450 to $700 to pull your transmission out, knowing they can't fix it for that price.
I didn't feel that was right. We know what it's going to cost.
Johnson and other franchise owners tell the I-Team AAMCO knows you're more likely to agree to spend thousands of dollars once the transmission's been taken apart. And if you decide the money's not worth it, some shops will charge you hundreds of dollars to put it back together.
They told me that I had to pay them $795 to put the transmission back in the vehicle.
Sheila Wilson says a Maryland AAMCO wanted more than $6,000 to repair her transmission after it had been pulled out of her Mitsubishi. AAMCO says Wilson authorized them to pull the transmission out for the $795, something she denies.
I said, well, you know what? Just give me the vehicle. You don't need to put the transmission back in. Well, they wouldn't do that.
Instead, she says AAMCO started charging her storage fees until Wilson served the shop's owner with court papers. Suddenly, she got her car back at no charge. In a statement, AAMCO says transmission problems are the most complicated and costly to repair. It is often impossible to diagnose the extent of a transmission problem until the transmission is removed from the vehicle and inspected. Our operational procedure is for the center to tell the customer up front what their cost will be to diagnose the transmission. After diagnosis, the customer is given an estimate of the necessary repair. If the customer does not authorize the repair, the faulty transmission must be reassembled and reinstalled at the quoted inspection price, which is not the repair price. But Veronica Anglade says that's not what happened to her.
The car was hijacked.
Nearly 2 years after she dropped off her black Mazda minivan at this AAMCO in Randallstown, Maryland, it's still sitting there.
I was so mad. I said, no, it doesn't work like that.
Anglade says she initially agreed to pay $800 to pull the transmission out, but says the price to fix the transmission jumped to $1,600 and then $3,400 after the transmission was in pieces.
You can't do nothing with the car in parts.
Anglade says the shop wanted $1,000 to put the transmission back in. She refused. In a statement, the owner of the shop told us a different story. The labor charge to remove and evaluate her transmission was $1,250. We have no use for her vehicle, but since we have not heard from Miss Anglade, we find ourselves with a broken vehicle sitting in our parking lot.
I want my car back fixed.
When we told AAMCO's corporate headquarters about Anglade's minivan, the company decided to give it back. Our cameras were rolling when they hooked up the van and towed it back to her house at no charge.
I'm happy to have it back.